About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, this show that explores what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be much fuller if we understood it better. I am Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and culture. And through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org, and Noetic is spelled Noetic. Now, through these programs, we've learned that although the medical world defines consciousness as what we're aware of now, most of what goes on in the mind is not in our conscious awareness at all, but goes on in other aspects of our mind or consciousness. Besides our normal awareness, we have what keeps our bodies going and includes our fears and beliefs about threats and dangers, which we're calling the subconscious mind, and what connects us with our highest ideals and guides us in our actions, called the superconscious mind. We learned that we can change our state of consciousness so we're aware of different aspects of mind at different times. And then we learned that the brain modifies whatever sensory signals it receives to fit past patterns of experience, following a default network or structure in the brain. This means that we perceive, we see, hear, taste, smell, and feel how our brains are wired to experience based on the past. We learned that no one has yet been able to pinpoint how ideas and thoughts are formed in brain tissue, and we saw that our body often responds faster than nerve impulses or chemicals can travel, and before we are conscious or aware of it. Some experiments have even demonstrated that a person's mind continues to perceive and process for as much as several hours, even when the brain and heart are flatlined and the person has been declared dead. Based on all this, many scientists have come to accept that what we call mind is not the product of the electrochemical activity of the cells that make up the brain, but is in fact the activity of a field that surrounds and permeates the brain and the body. It's possible to measure at least a portion of this field as electromagnetic activity for several inches around the body, in what some say is an egg shape, extending from below our knees to a few inches above our heads. Mind, then, is a field, a pattern of energy that exists whether the body is functioning or not, and permeates and develops with the body and brain. This means that the brain is best understood as a receiver-transmitter, receiving messages from the mind and transmitting them to the body, and receiving messages from the organs and the senses and transmitting them to the body as the subconscious mind. Some researchers are exploring how the two hemispheres of our brain are involved in this transmitting and receiving from the world through the left hemisphere and with our larger mind through the right hemisphere. We've learned that this field of mind affects energy and matter in a variety of ways. For example, when the subatomic building blocks of the universe show up as energy or matter in quantum physics experiments, depending on whether a mind is present to observe them. Or when people's bodies and pets have been observed to change when someone they're connected with turns attention their way. Individuals and collective human minds also change the readouts from random number generators, as on the network of computers run by the Global Consciousness Project. Now, every field is a unique pattern of vibration that's different from other fields, and these fields can vibrate along similar patterns, resonating with each other, and affect each other across space and time, like tuning forks can affect each other. As a result, a growing number of scientists are seeing our individual mind as part of a larger field. They're equating the mind with the quantum or zero-point field out of which all matter and energy arise. And some researchers are using the equations of quantum mechanics, relativity, and computer learning algorithms to describe the role of consciousness in the formation of matter. Together, these understandings are helping to explain things like what's called the law of attraction, how the world around us mirrors what our consciousness is focusing on, how we can access information through insight, intuition, and channeling, how dreams affect the body and our other aspects of consciousness, how music affects the brain and the body and connects us with other minds, how we can enhance or slow down healing through our thoughts, emotions, and visualizations, and how the belief in a treatment can help a patient experience healing in the placebo effect, how remote viewing and telekinesis can work, and how we can get into a state of flow in which the mind and the brain are in sync, maximizing our effectiveness. And finally, how our thoughts and emotions affect our overall well-being. You can catch up on our past shows on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips, the books, and the authors that I use on this show. Today, we're going to look specifically at the brain. Now, we've said the brain is a receiver-transmitter, but it is a very complex device, far more complicated than any computer is likely to be at any time in the near future. And we're going to look at two things. One is the increasing reporting of something that's called brain fog. And then we're going to look at some of the things that some neuroscientists are doing, stimulating very specific regions of the brain to accomplish very specific results. So the brain fog issue has come up in a lot of places, and a fairly recent article in the Journal of Neurology, Neurosurgery, and Psychiatry is attempting to not only define it, but is also trying to help us understand the range of experiences that people are calling brain fog. They spent several weeks just tracking what was going on in the social media using that term. And as they say, the term brain fog is often used in descriptions of persistent symptoms post-COVID-19, both by individuals seeking treatment and in communications between healthcare professionals. Some have suggested that the origins of brain fog are in a neurasthenia-like complex of somatic and cognitive symptoms that were first described in the 1800s. But more recently, brain fog is understood as a constellation of cognitive symptoms, which may be due to, quote, inflammatory molecules. Yet we rarely hear of reports of brain fog from patients that are dealing with acute neuroinflammatory conditions. So there's little likelihood that that's probably what's going on. The writers of the paper say, in the cognitive neurology clinic, we might sometimes see patients who complain not of brain fog, but of clouded thinking or cognitive clouding. Similarly, patients with disordered sleep and those taking sedative medications might complain of feeling foggy. So this group of researchers went out and tried to find out what it was that was going on. And they found, over a few weeks, 1,663 posts with the term brain fog, 717 of which fit their definition. And of those, they found a lot of overlapping descriptions. Some combination of forgetfulness, difficulty concentrating, dissociative phenomena, that is, not feeling like I am present in the middle of something I'm doing, perceived cognitive slowness and excessive effort, communication difficulties, and a feeling of grogginess or fuzziness. So those were the kinds of things people were describing as they used the term brain fog. The study went on. Of the included posts, 570 of them attributed brain fog to a particular cause, half of which said to a particular disease, most of whom said COVID-19, and some of whom said long COVID. A fair number of which also, about a third, said they were feeling that was connected to prescribed or non-prescribed drug use or discontinuation. And then a few people cited other weirdnesses in their behaviors that might be the sort. So the single most common stated causal attribution was long COVID. Now, this was in 2021, so people were still being very much aware of that when they were doing this research, although it was published much later. So we don't know that they would get the same results today, but I wouldn't be too surprised given what I've seen in the social media. So in their discussion, they say, exploring symptom phenomenology, that is, the subjective experience, is key to diagnosis, they say, and in turn to determining the correct treatment in many areas of medicine. They say, a neurologist cannot measure the nature of severity of another person's pain, but in asking them to describe it, we might establish that it is caused by a specific thing. And suggests that simply being curious about what the person is saying is a very important part of the practitioner's approach. And they're suggesting that it's not just associated with COVID-19. So we need to be aware, these neurologists are suggesting, that this is a term that is very common in use now, but it is describing a variety of symptoms and a variety of potential causes. So the practitioner needs to be very curious about what it is the patient is actually talking about and not just jumping on the term brain fog. That's an overlapping set, as they say, of cognitive, emotional, and physical symptoms which are experienced in a variety of conditions and circumstances. It's out there. Neurologists are trying to understand it. They may or may not be able to do much good for you if you can't pay attention more fully to the specifics of what you are calling brain fog. So why am I bringing up a study about something that people are calling brain fog on my show about Noetics? It's because this receiver-transmitter that we call the brain is this wonderfully complex biological system that is affected by biological circumstances that we can do something about without resorting to chemical and biochemical solutions that might be offered. But we need to be aware that if certain parts of the brain are not functioning appropriately, it's because there is some miswiring going on in the brain that is related to the state of consciousness we are actually experiencing in the moment. It's possible, as our next piece of the show is going to look at, to treat the brain as if it were separate from the being that we are, to treat it as an electrochemical system. It's an intriguing approach that materialist scientists are very excited about and can lead to some very interesting understandings about how this receiver-transmitter we call the brain actually functions. I'm going to let Brian Greene and his guests on Decoding the Brain tell you more.
Our approach has been to understand the neural code for our ability to articulate words and speak. And what I mean by that is the patterning of electrical activity that's generated by the brain activity in the temporal lobe and in the motor cortex that's above it. It's that very precise coordination of neural activity that gives rise to words and sentences. And so for the past decade, we've worked with patients of ours in San Francisco at the University of California, San Francisco, who have volunteered as part of medical treatments that they've had for treatment of their seizures when implanted electrodes were placed directly on the brain surface with very, very small sensors, maybe the ones you're referring to record that electrical activity at the order of millimeters and milliseconds. And with those kind of recordings, we've been able to decipher and correlate those electrical brain patterns with individual consonants and vowels, as well as syllables, in order to give rise to words.
Yes, indeed, you heard that correctly. They are stimulating specific areas of the brain to make the sounds. They've identified 40 different sounds that lead to the formation of sentences, and they have been able to help people trying to say something to do so. Well, if you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments, a radio show exploring what consciousness is, how it works, and how our lives can be greatly enhanced as we understand it more fully. I'm Ruth Miller, your host, and that sound tells me it's time to look at whatever might help us understand more fully what's going on in the news and in the world today. And to answer any questions you email to ruth@noeticmoments.org. I'm going to go back to the Brian Greene material. We were just hearing a man describing what his work with planting electrodes and sensors in specific areas of the brain is doing to help people actually formulate words. We know that that's part of the brain's job. So he's identified the specific points within a millimeter in individual brains that facilitate that for speech.
It turns out that imagining speaking is very, very different than actually speaking. So the act of speaking is a fully intentional and volitional event, whereas when you're just thinking about a thought or even imagining the words, it's a different neural activity pattern that's much more subtle and complex, and that we have a lot more work to figure out how that works. But the actual production of words has become much more clear over the last 5 years.
Proof that you are seeking is not available in books.
The proof that you are seeking is not available in books.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
Shipbuilding is a most fascinating process.
So we're really excited in terms of achieving that milestone, yet there's still a lot more to do to make it better.
Planting electrodes and stimulating specific areas of the brain to get the mouth to move, to make specific syllables and actually create a sequence that we would recognize as a sentence. They used a speech synthesizer to convert the signals from the brain through a computer, kind of like what Stephen Hawking used to do, but he used a keyboard. This is directly from the speech centers in the brain, telling a computer and speech synthesizer what it is the person is attempting to say. Huge breakthrough in the receiver-transmitter function of the brain. He does point out that imagining is different from doing, and that's, again, part of the difference between what mind does and what the brain does. There were other people on this show that Brian Greene hosted, which is part of what's called the World Science Festival. And one of them is a woman who's been working with depression. And she's having similar experiences. If she puts an electrode at a very specific spot in the brain, people are no longer feeling that repressed sense that is often associated with depression. And they are now able to function. They're able to make the connections.
We basically took the hypothesis based on this imaging, on this map that we had that really told us there were brain areas that were working together, but their synchrony was dysregulated. And we basically had reason to believe that one area deep in the brain seemed to be the ringleader. It was really focused, the subcallosal cingulate. It's connections to midline thalamus, like Michael talks about. It's connections to the hippocampus that Mike Kahana talks about. It's connections to the frontal cortex, to the hypothalamus, to other parts of the brainstem. It seemed to be focused in a place that if it didn't change, it wreaked havoc on everything else. We didn't take epilepsy patients. We took depressed people who had failed multiple drugs, psychotherapy, electroconvulsive shock therapy. They're pretty much at the end of the line. They were in that attractor state. They are stuck and they can't get out. And we basically said, can we leverage the technology that's used in Parkinson's, implant with anatomical precision in this area and in the white matter that connects it to these other areas in this putative circuit. And actually, when we stimulate at high frequency, it's like we release the lockdown of this region and people kind of come out of it. So as we got better and better at it with our imaging, we can plan the surgery precisely within millimeters, place it at this convergence of these multiple pathways that we know interact with each other. And we know that from animal studies, we know that from epilepsy studies. And when we apply the high frequency stimulation, we can predict that someone will emerge. And what they describe is that the negative turns off, and it's as though they kind of come back online. They can pay attention, they feel connected, they feel like they can move. So the paralysis kind of goes away, and that happens very rapidly. And if you give the stimulation, even in the operating room, 10, 15 minutes so that we can record and actually see what happens. We leave the operating room and they'll stay well, several weeks without further stim. And then we actually turn it on and give stimulation. And we have patients that have these chronic implants, have this pacemaker on all the time, and people are better and go about their business, so that we've reset something very fast. And then we've allowed the brain, again, I'll use this self-organizing principle, to relearn who you are with a brain that doesn't get stuck.
Okay, so we're learning more and more how this biological mechanism that is this receiver and transmitter can work. Various parts of the brain get shut down and are not receiving the signal they need to receive. It's possible to deal with it in this electromechanical way, the way these experimenters are doing it. It's also possible for most people in most circumstances to rewire the neuronal patterns so that they don't have to be shut down in those ways. One of the things that I thought I would give you is another tool, a book by Daniel Goleman. He wrote Emotional Intelligence years ago, called Focus. It's designed for managers, interestingly, and talks about how leaders need to be focused, which is supporting and supported by the work that I did with Kazimierz Gazds in our book, Developing Third-Generation Learning Organizations. But Daniel Goleman is saying, in very recent years, the science of attention has blossomed. That science tells us that skills determine how well we perform any task. If our attention skills are stunted, we do poorly. Our very nimbleness in life depends on this subtle faculty. This subtle tool, he says, embeds within countless mental operations. A short list of some basics include comprehension, memory, learning, sensing how we feel and why, reading emotions in other people, and interacting smoothly. Surfacing this invisible factor in effectiveness let us better see the benefits. So he says, our journey begins with exploring some basics of attention. Cognitive science studies a wide array, including concentration, selective attention, and open awareness. Vital abilities build on such basic mechanics of our mental life. And he goes on and says, for leaders to get the results, they need all three kinds of focus. Inner focus, attuned to our intuitions, guiding values, and better decisions. Other focus, that smooths our connections to the people in our lives. And outer focus, that lets us navigate in the larger world. A leader tuned out of his internal world will be rudderless. One blind to the world of others will be clueless, and those indifferent to the larger systems within which they operate will be blindsided. He goes on to say, attention, from the Latin word attendere, to reach toward, connects us with the world. In his second chapter, he talks a little bit about what he calls the basics. The neural capacity to beam in on just one target while ignoring a sea of incoming stimuli. This is what William James, a founder of modern psychology, meant when he defined attention as the sudden taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one of what seems several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. This from the book Focus by Daniel Goleman. It's been around a little while, and I think you will find it very useful as a tool if you are finding this thing that we're calling brain fog to be an issue for you without having to rely on an electrical stimulus in the brain. Well, we're out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there are links to archived past shows, along with titles and links to other resources that we refer to on the show. And you can send me your comments and questions, which I will do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments, recorded in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon. And have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic Sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.